Hi, everybody. I'm also not somebody who likes to be behind a podium, so hopefully I don't stray too far away. I changed the title of the talk. Sorry about that. Thank you for having me. I'm really glad Mike went before me because it will, I think, make my talk make more sense and seem less left field. Because I'm going to talk about history of psychology a little bit, but I am going to talk about something kind of different, which is whether or not the methodological research that most of us do is moving into practice, and how we can improve psychology as a science if we think more about teaching methodology. And I'm doing this work with Jolynn, who's my mentor at York University, and also Ian Davidson is a student, a graduate student in the history and theory of psychology, and having his perspective and thinking through some of these issues has been really insightful, so I want to acknowledge him. So I'm going to go on a little bit of a windy road. I'm going to talk about the state of epistemology at the birth of psychological science and how that context has helped us to institutionalize certain practices. And we can, I think, draw a connection between those practices and the current crisis that we're in. And then I'm going to share with you some of the research that Jolynn and I have done that are systematic reviews of practice, and hopefully feel like what seems like a part of the solution, talk about teaching and how we can work past the supposed crisis that our field is currently in. So in the beginning, psychology was an area of philosophy, and Kant has been quoted saying, well, I don't know if psychology will ever be a proper science. So as a science, we've always been really self-conscious. We want to be a real science when we grow up. Later on, in the latter half of the 19th century, you see epistemology really change, this movement toward objectivity, knowing things by numbers, finding ways to measure things. This is when the meter was created. I mean, it was a useful time. It was a good time. It influenced science and everyday life. This co-happens with psychology really busting out and saying, no, we're science, we have labs, we do science. So if we fast forward to the 1950s, psychology kind of starts to grow and really come on the scene. We start to see this mechanical objectivity, this truth in numbers get institutionalized into how we teach and train psychologists. It starts popping up into textbooks, statistical rules, rituals, and statistical checklists. So we have this kind of lack of trust of subjective expertise and judgment in our field. We really trust the numbers. And we all know of these things because as methodologists, we love to hate p less than 0.05. We hate rules of thumb for effect sizes. We hate this cookbook statistical thinking that we see much of our field engaged in. And even in the modeling revolution, we see cutoffs. We see our statistical models boiled down to a series of cutoffs. It's like we can't escape it as a field. And the best example of this, the ubiquity of this checklist science that we're engaged in, is the Intro Stats textbook, where the student gets imparted the fundamental wisdom of psychology, which is the null hypothesis test. And I teach Intro Stats, and I teach this checklist about how to do the null hypothesis significance test. And I think it's worth saying that when you're a novice, maybe you need a checklist, or when you're first learning something, you don't have the expertise to go beyond the checklist. But we can argue that the entire way that psychologists are trained reinforce the checklist. It goes much beyond introduction to statistics. If we think about our standard curriculum, we have two streams. We have content training, intro to psych, social psych, developmental psych, the survey courses, and then some seminar courses like motivation theory or perception. And then you have your methods training, which goes in a parallel but separate track. So introduction to stats and methods, those might be bundled, they might not be. A data analysis course, and maybe if you're lucky, you get an advanced course, maybe qualitative methods or structural equation modeling. This goes for undergraduate and graduate teaching. So we teach students the checklist in one track, and then they try to hop over and do the checklist in the content track. It's not integrated. And you're saying, okay, but as we develop expertise and everybody in this room, we don't do that. We don't do the cookbook. We know that methodological practices and theory are fundamentally intertwined. And when we think about it that way and we don't do the cookbook, we do really good science. And obviously, we've been having this discussion all day, so I'm like preaching to the choir. But I think we have to recognize that we're not on the same page as the rest of the field. We have these institutionalized checklists. They're in our textbooks. They could easily be used to summarize the entire way that people get PhDs in psychology. And they're actually how we generate knowledge in our field. You get a publication when you complete the checklist. Maybe you check assumptions, but you get try to check that off as soon as possible. And then you get to the p-value, you get to the effect size, you report the model fit, check, check, you have a publication. And if you want to go outside of this, you're not reinforced for doing so. You're not reinforced for using different methodologies. Qualitative methodology, of course, is part of that, or other things. So this is like a dogma in our field, and it's actively threatening our science. It's not really a question. I should remove the question mark. I'm sure you have heard that the Collaboration for Open Science published a paper in Science saying that our psychology studies could not be reproduced. It got a lot of media attention. We got to be famous for not being reproducible or replicable. You know, the ASA even got together and was like, look, p-values do not replace the scientific thinking. And like all things, that was debated. Some people used different statistics to look at the replicability and said, we don't have a replication crisis. And then, of course, we were in a crisis about whether or not we were in a crisis. And I don't know, I will remain agnostic to whether or not we're in a crisis, but I'm going to share with you some of the work that Jolyn and I have been doing on how methodology is used in practice in applied areas of psychology, and I will give you the punchline now. We are at least in a methodological crisis. So I'm going to talk about two areas where the checklist doesn't serve us well. One of those areas is mediation. There's some people in this room who know a lot about mediation. You know mediation is more than a statistical procedure and a series of p-values. You know that it has a lot to do with research design, and how you interpret your mediation analysis is really based on your research design. Another area, which is what I'm interested in, is construct validation and measurement. That's another place where a checklist or a simple statistical rule doesn't serve us well. Measurement is a really theoretical process and requires diverse methodologies. So I'll start with sharing you some of our work that we've done on systematic reviews of mediation practice. And I can't take credit for this. This project exists before I met Jolyn. She has funding from the Social Science Research Council of Canada about improving the practice of mediation. And she herself, not me, found 1,600 articles and using the PsycInfo database. So this will be across all areas of psychology in a 10-year period that mention mediation in the abstract. In statistical mediation, not like couples mediating a problem. So she took a random sample, about 10% of those, and there was 160 articles, and started coding them. What are the mediations? What are the coefficients? What's the research design? What are the sample sizes? How are the mediated effects estimated? How are their standard errors estimated? There were 995 instances of mediations. So there's just this like staggering number of statistical tests being conducted. So when we think about research design, really the foundation to making a conclusion in a mediation analysis, we don't see what we would think is best practice. Most mediations are conducted on cross-sectional data. They're a statistical checklist sort of thing. We don't see temporal precedence in the majority of times, longitudinal data, or experimental manipulations. Things that most of us would say are kind of fundamental to making the claim that we think people want to make when they do a mediation. As far as statistical approaches, actually the testing part, the causal steps method is most prevalent. It's the most common method. Bootstrapping, even in the more recent years from this, is still a rare way to get that indirect effect. And we're just now unpacking this. This is a really large project, but 43% of the papers have at least one statistical error. So this might be degrees of freedom. This might be something minor, like, well, I don't know if it's minor if your degrees of freedom and your test statistic and your p-value don't line up, but maybe like reporting errors versus other things that are more substantial, like continuing on with a mediation when it was clear that it didn't make sense or you didn't satisfy basic assumptions. This is when we started to really, I think about this teaching and training piece of it. We did an informal survey because we were wondering, well, how are people getting trained? Where are they learning mediation? And this is, if you do sampling research, this is not a good sample. We just asked people, convenient sample. We got a couple hundred people, mostly PhDs in social and personality. And we said, well, how did you learn about mediation? And they said they learned about it on the streets. They learned about it by reading books on their own, reading articles on their own, and visiting websites. So I think Chris Preacher was here. They're going to your website. And then we said, okay, well, how should mediation be taught? And they were like, we don't want to learn it on the streets. It should be taught in a graduate statistics course or in a formal workshop or in a research methods course. Being a part of this project really inspired me to think about how this similar issue might be occurring in measurement, which is my area of interest and where most of my training is in measurement. And so I took on, and actually we talked to Mike about this about a year ago, and we did the project. You said we should do it, and we did it.
Sorry.
Yeah, I know, it was a ton of work. So we did a smaller systematic review looking at articles published in JPSP, just in 1 year, 30%. And I was really interested in this idea of ongoing validation. And when people use a scale that's been previously developed, do they think about whether or not that scale is working as they would, as they're assuming in their own sample or in a new context? I'm interested in measurement invariance, and I thought that I was going to learn about how people are using measurement invariance when I did this review. That didn't happen. So we pulled these articles, and we found that there were 700 measures broadly defined. And each JPSP paper has about 20 measures in it. So again, people are collecting a lot of variables, a lot of different measures. Most of those measures are item-based scales, where most of us in this room would say this construct validation framework is in play. If you're going to use item-based scales, you need some evidence that you're capturing what you think you're capturing. The rest of them are things like reaction time, IAT, demographic variables, physiological measures. 30% of those are one-item scales. This does not include pilot studies or manipulation checks. This is primary variables of interest. Only that one golden paper talked about validity evidence for their item-based scale. These people are anonymous, but 40% of the scales had no stated source. So this is passive voice at its finest. 10 items were used to. You never know where those items came from. Presumably they came from the authors, they developed them, but they don't actually say that. So if we think about validity evidence for those scales, what sort of validity evidence are people reporting? So the previously developed scales, the one that actually do have a citation and have a source, most of those scales, they'll report a reliability coefficient, alpha. 18%, no information. So this is, we use a Rosenberg self-esteem scale, that's it. And then more is just anything else besides reliability. It could be a factor analysis, it could be another reliability coefficient, it could be correlations between subscales on a larger scale. So what about those scales that don't have a source or were said to be developed by the author? 78% of those will only report a reliability. And you have 19% that have no information. 10 items were used to measure, that's it. No, not even reliability. So I think this is the complete failure of the checklist. Construct validation has essentially been boiled down to alpha greater than 0.80. That's what's occurred. We did not necessarily get the checklist from the textbook, but we made up one. We made check the statistical rituals complete. And the same goes for mediation. Mediation doesn't lend itself to a simple set of statistical rules, but people are boiling it down to that. It's a series of significant results. So these practices don't support a strong psychological science. It is a crisis. So Jolyn and I sit down with Ian to think about, well, what are we going to talk about in this talk about teaching? And we generated a bunch of ideas. Why is this happening? How can we fix it? There's publication pressure, and there's not enough tenure track jobs, and there's this reliance on adjunct teaching, large class sizes, just like on and on and on and on and on. And we did not get closer to finishing this talk, and we felt crippled by it. But I think if we remind ourselves, if we assume that psychology is a science and we don't think too much about philosophy, what are we trying to do? We're trying to interpret something and make a conclusion so we can generate knowledge. And right now we have this thing where most of that's propped up on statistics, except for the qualitative people in the room. And when you think about the replication crisis, that's what everybody's focused on. They're focused on statistics, like not p-hacking or reporting, basically not doing exploratory analyses anymore, pre-registering all of their things. But the foundation of the pyramid is actually measurement, design, and theoretical expertise. And we know from reviews by people in this room that there's limited formal training on these things. People are not, maybe they won't have a measurement course. They may not have very many research design courses. And when they take their theory courses, they're not really fundamentally intertwined with their methodology courses, so they might not be able to make that connection that comes with after a long time of expertise. So if we're going to teach methodology into the 21st century, I think that there's a lot of macro-level solutions, which some of you are going to talk about later today, like changing our curriculum, emphasizing goal 2, which is critical thinking, valuing the scholarship of teaching and learning. Please write up the thing that you tried in your class about the flipped classroom. Write that up, and when you see that on somebody's vita, respect that they did a study in their class. Of course, we need more methods, people. At the micro level, we have to emphasize the full research process, make sure we're combining methods and theory. We should have content people at this conference and working with us on these things, the substantive areas. They should be working with us. We should co-teach with them. We should present assumptions violations as substantively meaningful, for example. And we should reinforce thoughtful design and measurement. And if you're a reviewer, you should help us reinforce that. So teaching methodology is really going to be about improving our science. Open science, pre-registering, not p-hacking, those things are really important, but they're not going to fix the foundation of the pyramid. If we frame better teaching and training, we need to frame better teaching and training and methods as fundamental to improving our science and facing the challenges that we currently have as a field. When we talk about improving psychological science, methodologists need to be at the table. We need to be pushing back on the checklist dogma. So there's a Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science meeting at UVA in the summer. I will go there. I will try to tell them this. I need you guys to work with me on it. So really the takeaway is all these things are intertwined. We need to teach in a way that reinforces that and know that it's going to hopefully help us get past the current crisis that we're in, even though we've potentially always been in a crisis. If you have any questions about this, you can email me. That's all.
How much, in a typical class, how much time do you devote to the methods and the measurement stuff? You were teaching an intro.
Yeah, I've taught intro and I've taught graduate courses, and I taught intro stats, so I didn't teach any methods. And I don't think you can tell an instructor in one class to teach all that stuff in the pyramid. We have to rethink our whole curriculum. And the APA guidelines for the undergraduate major, you could extend them to the graduate side with goal 2, critical thinking and scientific inquiry and information literacy. We should potentially redesign our whole curriculum to kind of fundamentally intertwine it. Reed College does this. Reed College teaches intro to psych at the undergraduate level in a year-long way with research design. And the culmination of that is doing a project. But in an individual course, it's going to be really difficult to get away from this checklist kind of statistical ritual dogma. We have to rework our whole curriculum. And we're not really reinforced to spending a lot of time thinking about those issues at a lot of the research institutions. So no, I don't do it at all. I'm doing it. I'm doing what I'm telling you not to do.